What's good, YouTube? What's good, viewers, man? Welcome back to the channel. How a retired garbage man pulled off a $10 million heist without leaving a trace, bro. That's what we're going to check out today. Hey, man. I want to know how George did it, bro. Richard. What am I saying? I want to know how Richard did it. Why did I call him George? Probably because it's garbage. But anyways, I want to know how Richard did it, bro. Because I'm not really going to do it, but I want to know how he did it. So, yeah, man, we go check this one out. Make sure y'all like, share, subscribe. Do the dudes, man. Let's get to at least 10,000 likes. I don't think that's a lot. Let's get to 10,000 likes. That's a small amount, so let's do it. Let's start at 5,000, then get to 10,000. But let's check this one out, man.
Richard Barlow had lived a quiet, unassuming life. At 64, his days of hard labor as a construction worker were behind him, but not by choice. Years of wear and tear had left him with chronic back pain and aching joints. Yet he had no choice but to return to work when his modest pension proved inadequate. Medical bills and the rising cost of living in Philadelphia had forced him into a job few people wanted, hauling garbage. For Richard, the job was a lifeline. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it kept him afloat. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Every morning before dawn, Richard would climb aboard the truck alongside the driver, making his way through the streets of Philadelphia. His route often took him through a mix of residential neighborhoods, business districts, and industrial zones. On this particular morning in late 2018, the biting cold wind cut through his jacket as he worked, emptying bins into the compactor with the mechanical rhythm he'd grown accustomed. The routine was the same as always, and his thoughts were elsewhere. On the rent due at the end of the month, on the creaking sound his old truck made, and on the dull ache in his knees that seemed to grow worse with every shift. The truck came to a stop outside a row of office buildings that had seen better days. These buildings were slated for redevelopment, their tenants long gone. The area was quiet, with few signs of life except for the occasional stray cat darting between dumpsters. Richard hoisted one particularly heavy bin into the compactor and heard the familiar rumble as the garbage was crushed. But then came an unexpected metallic clink, a sound that stood out amid the usual cacophony of trash. It wasn't unusual for random objects to make noise, but this was different. Curious, Richard leaned over and peered into the dumpster. At the bottom, half covered in paper and debris, was a small key. It wasn't just any key. It looked sturdy and important, attached to a worn leather fob engraved with the number 418. Richard's first thought was that it belonged to a filing cabinet or perhaps an office storage unit discarded during the cleanup. For a moment, he considered tossing it back into the compactor with the rest of the trash, but something about it gave him pause. He picked it up and inspected it briefly. The leather fob was scratched and faded, and the key itself was slightly tarnished, but otherwise intact. Richard shrugged and slipped the key into his jacket pocket. He didn't think much of it at the time. Keys were commonplace in his line of work, and this one seemed no different. Maybe it had some value to someone, or maybe it didn't. Either way, it was better to keep it than to destroy it, just in case. By the end of his shift, the key was all but forgotten, buried under the mental weight of his daily worries. But that small decision, to pocket the key instead of discarding it, would prove to be the turning point in Richard's otherwise uneventful life. As he went about his usual routine in the days that followed, the key sat quietly in his jacket pocket, waiting for its moment to reveal the secrets it held. Richard had no way of knowing it yet, but that single, seemingly insignificant object was about to pull him into a chain of events that would change everything. A week had passed since Richard Barlow had found the key, and it had almost entirely slipped from his mind. Life had continued in its monotonous cycle, early mornings on the garbage truck, aching joints, and evenings spent counting pennies to make ends meet. On his first day off in over a week, Richard decided to clean out his work jacket.
Well, I wonder why Richard was keeping it for so long without, testing it. Is he a hoarder or something?
Which he hadn't washed in ages. As he emptied the pockets, out tumbled a small key with a weathered leather fob marked 418. For a moment, Richard stared at it, turning it over in his hands. The memory of where he had found it came rushing back, the dumpster behind the old office building. He wondered what it might unlock. A filing cabinet, a safe. He thought about throwing it away. But then, something clicked in his mind. The number 418 seemed familiar. He recalled passing a row of storage units during his garbage route not far from the office building. The units were old, their metal siding rusted and paint peeling, but they had numbers stenciled above the doors. Could it be a match? Curiosity got the better of him. With nothing planned for the day, Richard decided to check it out. He drove his beat-up truck.
If y'all would know how many people especially passed away, leaving money in like storage units and houses and like old houses. People would go will pass away and someone would sell it to someone and there's money even in the walls and stuff and no one knows about it, bro. Like it is crazy if y'all would even know that.
Truck to the storage facility on the edge of town. The facility had clearly seen better days. The gate hung slightly askew on its hinges, and the sign at the entrance was so faded that the name was almost unreadable. The lot was deserted, save for a few abandoned cars that looked like they hadn't been moved in years. Richard parked near the units and began walking down the row, scanning the numbers above each door. His heart skipped a beat when he reached unit 418. The storage unit looked as neglected as the rest of the facility. The metal door was streaked with rust and cobwebs clung to the corners. The padlock was old and corroded as if it hadn't been touched in years. Richard felt a rush of adrenaline.
I'm done spending an obscene amount of money on takeout. Done.
Let's go.
What were the chances that this key would actually fit? He pulled it out and inserted it into the lock. To his surprise, it turned smoothly, and the padlock popped open with a satisfying click. Richard hesitated, his hand on the handle. This wasn't his property, and he had no idea what might be inside. The logical thing to do would be to lock it back up and walk away, but the urge to satisfy his curiosity overwhelmed him. Slowly, he rolled up the door, revealing the dark interior of the unit. The smell of dust and mildew wafted out as the sunlight illuminated the contents. The unit was packed with what appeared to be the remnants of an old business. Dusty cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly, along with rusted filing cabinets and broken office chairs. Richard stepped inside, his boots crunching on loose papers scattered across the floor. At first glance, nothing stood out. He rummaged through a few boxes, finding faded invoices, outdated office supplies, and tangled cords for old electronics. It looked like someone had shut down an office years ago and simply abandoned the contents here. Just as he was about to give up and leave, something in the far corner caught his eye. It was a large, unmarked metal case, partially hidden beneath a tattered office chair. The case was sturdy, its surface scratched and dented, but still intact. A heavy combination padlock secured it shut. Unlike the rest of the items in the unit, this case didn't look like it had been forgotten. It looked deliberately hidden. Richard's heart began to race as he approached the case. He bent down and tried to lift it, but it was incredibly heavy, as though something substantial was inside. His mind raced with possibilities. Money, jewelry, documents. Whatever was inside, it was clearly important enough to lock away. He ran his hand over the cool metal surface, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just some abandoned office junk. This case was different. Someone had taken care to secure it, and yet it had been left behind, hidden in a forgotten storage unit, waiting for someone to find it. The silence of the storage facility suddenly felt deafening. Richard straightened up and looked around, half expecting someone to appear and accuse him of trespassing. But the lot remained empty, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. He knew he couldn't open the case here, not without tools, and not without risking being seen. With a deep breath, Richard made a decision. He dragged the heavy case out of the unit and loaded it into the back of his truck. Whatever secrets it held, he would uncover them later, in the safety of his own home. But first, there would be tampered with evidence that bore most certainty of sexual assault. Richard spent the entire next day staring at the metal case sitting squarely on the floor of his apartment. The weight of it, not just the physical heft, but the sense of mystery surrounding its contents.
Hey, would y'all take it up? Like, would y'all even go looking for whatever that key belongs to? And would y'all take the safe up? Because y'all don't know what is inside, but would y'all take it up?
It was almost too much to bear. He hadn't slept well, and his mind raced with possibilities. What if the case contained something dangerous? What if it belonged to someone who had come looking for it? Still, curiosity gnawed at him, and by mid-morning, he couldn't wait any longer. From his closet, Richard retrieved his old bolt cutters, a relic from his construction days. He inspected the padlock one more time before carefully snapping it off with a clean, decisive cut. The lock clattered to the floor, and Richard hesitated before lifting the lid. His hands were trembling slightly, but he forced himself to pull it open. Inside was something he never could have imagined in his wildest dreams. Stacks of crisp, neatly bundled cash. Hundreds upon hundreds of $100 bills, packed tightly in rows, filled the case nearly to the brim. Richard's breath caught as he tried to comprehend what he was looking at. After a moment, he began counting. Each bundle was marked $10,000, and there were rows upon rows of them. He quickly lost track, but estimated there had to be at least $10 million inside. Richard sat back on his heels, staring at the case in stunned silence. The sheer volume of cash was overwhelming, far beyond anything he had ever seen in his modest working-class life. This was life-changing money. But with the
Let me tell you that, bro. Finding that, it would be stealing, because it's not yours. You found the key, it would be stealing. But boy, I'm telling you, man, I'm on the next plane. You can't just, you can't just go on a plane with $10 million. You'd have to have a plan. I'm going somewhere though. I'm not staying where I would normally stay. I'm leaving that house. I'm getting out of here, bro, until I figure out how I'm going to do this. Like, how?
Shock came a flood of questions. Who would leave this amount of cash in a storage unit? Was it tied to criminal activity? Drug money? Embezzlement?
Probably.
And, most importantly, why had it been left behind? Among the cash were no obvious clues about its origins. There were no ledgers, no documents, no identifiers of any kind. Just the money itself. Richard felt both relief and unease. The lack of identification made it less likely that someone would trace the case back to him, but it also deepened the mystery. As the hours passed, Richard began to think practically. He couldn't take the cash to the bank. That much was clear.
Exactly.
Depositing even a fraction of it would raise red flags and questions he couldn't answer. He would have to keep the money hidden and use it sparingly, a little at a time. But what if someone came looking for it? What if the storage facility had cameras, or the case was reported stolen? These thoughts kept him pacing the apartment for hours. Then there was the question of the jewelry. Nestled among the bundles of cash were several small velvet pouches containing gold and diamonds. Richard inspected one of the bags, pulling out a gold necklace encrusted with small rubies. It was beautiful, but it also screamed trouble. Jewelry like this would be hard to sell without drawing attention, and it was far too recognizable if someone came looking for it. After some deliberation, Richard decided the jewelry wasn't worth the risk. He would return the case, with the gold and diamonds intact, to the storage unit and leave it there, ensuring no one would suspect it had been tampered with. The cash, however, was another matter. He reasoned that whoever left the money clearly hadn't come back for it, and it had likely been forgotten. Taking the cash, he thought, was different. It wasn't tied to anything specific that could be traced.
Say what?
By evening, Richard had packed the jewelry back into the case and carefully closed it, ensuring there were no obvious signs it had been opened. He replaced the padlock with one he purchased from the hardware store, choosing a random combination he wouldn't remember. At dusk, Richard returned the case to the storage unit. The lot was deserted, as he had hoped, and he worked quickly, sliding the case back into its original corner. With the jewelry and gold now off his hands, he felt a wave of relief. The cash, hidden safely in his apartment, would remain his secret, a lifeline for a man who had spent his entire life working for scraps. As far as Richard was concerned, he had done the smartest thing possible. The case was no longer his burden. Only the money was, for months. Richard lived his life with quiet caution. After retrieving the cash from the storage unit, he meticulously divided it into smaller, secure hiding spots. Some of the money went into a fireproof safe concealed beneath the floorboards of his bedroom. Another portion was stashed in a shoebox in his closet, carefully camouflaged beneath old clothes and random junk. The remainder he stored in a second, discreet storage unit he rented under an assumed name. Richard made sure never to spend conspicuously. He had learned one thing from his years of scraping by. Blending into the background was the best way to avoid scrutiny. Outwardly, nothing in his routine changed. He continued working his garbage route, hauling bins and driving through familiar neighborhoods.
Bro, I'm quitting,
Every day
bro.
felt the same, and Richard started to believe that no one would ever come looking for the case or its contents. The storage facility was forgotten and neglected, and he had left the jewelry and gold behind to divert suspicion. It seemed like the perfect plan, but in the spring of 2020, everything changed. One morning, as Richard sat in his apartment sipping coffee before his shift, the local news caught his attention. The demolition of the office building where he had originally found the key was making headlines. According to the report, a construction crew had stumbled upon a hidden compartment behind a wall during the teardown. Inside the compartment, they found old documents that raised eyebrows. Ledger pages, handwritten notes, and photographs.
Yeah?
Among the scattered papers, one key detail stood out. A reference to 418, which investigators quickly connected to a storage unit at the nearby facility. Richard's heart sank as the report continued. The detectives, acting on the lead from the documents, had searched Unit 418 and discovered the metal case he had returned.
snap.
Inside,
And
they found the gold
his fingerprints would
jewelry
be
and
on it.
coins he had left behind. The value of the contents was estimated to be in the millions, but what really caught their attention was the state of the case itself. Kins rang the doorbell. Though old and battered, the padlock securing it was clearly new, a modern, shiny lock that looked completely out of place compared to the worn, dusty exterior of the case. This single detail raised an unsettling question. Had someone accessed the storage unit and tampered with the case? The news anchor explained that investigators suspected the case might once have contained more than just the jewelry and gold, potentially cash or other valuables. However, with no inventory of the original contents, they had no way to confirm what, if anything, was missing. There was no surveillance footage from the storage facility, and the ledgers found in the office offered no specifics about the value or exact nature of the case's contents. While the authorities admitted that tampering was a possibility, they had no evidence to point to who might have accessed the case, or when. Richard sat frozen in his chair, his coffee growing cold. He had thought he'd been so careful. By returning the case to the unit, he had hoped to close the chapter entirely, leaving no trail behind. But the lock, his replacement lock, had now become a potential red flag. It was the only clue that someone might have interfered with the case after it had been placed in storage. Although the investigators admitted there was no way to know if anything was missing,
One of the coolest things about ZZZ is the environment.
Was enough to fuel their suspicions. For days after the news broke, Richard remained on edge. He avoided watching further updates, instead relying on overheard conversations and brief snippets from coworkers. It seemed that the case had gone cold. Without clear evidence, the investigation reached a standstill. Detectives could speculate all they wanted about the lock and the possibility of missing contents, but they had no proof to act on. Richard's relief was tempered by paranoia. He knew he had escaped detection, but the entire ordeal had left him shaken. He resolved to be even more cautious. Though the investigation into Unit 418 eventually faded from the public eye, the knowledge of how close he had come to being discovered lingered in Richard's mind.
That's just different, bro. I'm telling you, Richard, paranoia is gonna put him in the grave, man. Now someone else is gonna find all that cash, bro.
He told himself he had done everything he could to cover his tracks, but one thing was certain: he would never forget the lesson he'd learned, even the smallest detail. Something as simple as a shiny new lock could unravel the most careful plans. The events surrounding the discovery of the storage unit and the subsequent news reports had left Richard Barlow in a constant state of anxiety. Each day as he carried on with his garbage route, he felt as though eyes were on him, even if no one in his small circle gave him a second glance. Richard couldn't shake the fear that it was only a matter of time before something went wrong. What if there was something he had overlooked? Living with this paranoia, Richard began to realize that staying in Philadelphia wasn't an option. By mid-2020, Richard had made up his mind. He needed to leave. After weeks of consideration, he settled on a small rural town in Montana. His first step was to resign from his job. He did so under the guise of his age catching up to him, telling his supervisor he could no longer handle the physical demands of the work. Using a portion of the cash, Richard purchased a small cabin on the outskirts of the town. The property was modest but comfortable, with enough land to ensure privacy. He moved in quietly, paying in cash to avoid leaving any traceable transactions. The local real estate agent didn't ask many questions, and Richard didn't offer any detail. Life in Montana was exactly what Richard had hoped for. He spent his days tending to the cabin and taking long walks in the nearby forests. He lived frugally, spending only small amounts of cash at local stores and avoiding anything that might attract attention. Richard was just a quiet retiree looking for solitude. The investigation into the storage unit back in Philadelphia eventually faded from the news. Without concrete evidence or anyone coming forward to claim the case's contents, the authorities had no leads. The jewelry and gold left behind in the case became the focus of the story, while the possibility of missing cash remained a matter of speculation. Richard followed the story from afar, scanning online news articles for any developments. Each passing month brought him more reassurance that his secret was safe. In the quiet of his new home, Richard often reflected on the series of events that had brought him to this point. A single discarded key, found by chance in a dumpster, had changed his life in ways he never could have imagined. What began as a routine day on the garbage truck had ended with a second chance at life. A chance to live without financial worry in his secluded cabin, surrounded by the silence of the Montana wilderness. He finally found the peace he had been searching for, a quiet escape from a life that had always demanded so much and given so little in return.
Bro, $10 million. What would y'all do? A $10 million ain't no small cash, bro. Like, listen. First of all, I wouldn't take that long before I ditched. Wherever he was living in Philly, it wouldn't take me that long before I ditched Philly. I will be traveling, but then you can't go crazy. I would get caught. I would get caught. I would figure something out though. But hey, I'll figure something out. That's $10 million, bro. I wouldn't take that case back though. I would not have taken that case back because it had his fingerprints on it, and if they had like checked it for fingerprints and stuff, he would have probably be in a lot of trouble. Whatever documents is there, anything illegal there, they're gonna pin everything on him saying he was the mastermind behind it or stuff like that. So I wouldn't have taken that there. So hey, let me know what y'all would do though. I'll see y'all in the next video, man. Deuce.